You make the rules so you can break the rules. And the golden section and everything, it's like you're making a rule, or you're discovering, however it comes to be, but there's a rule for the creation. And then somewhere, breaking that allows you to have this freedom to do something.
Welcome to the Architecture, Design, and Photography podcast. Today we are speaking with architect Paul Lewandowski. Paul has over 25 years of professional experience as both an architect and interior designer. He's a past president of IIDA New England and is a licensed architect in Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and New York. He has served as a juror for the AIA Design Awards, Best of Neocon, and other design competitions. He has spoken nationally on design theory, workplace, creativity, and trends. In addition to design work in architecture and interiors, Paul has designed textiles, carpeting, and fashion. Our interview today is sponsored by Maine Home Design. Don't miss Paul's AIA Design Theory article in the upcoming January issue of Maine Home Design. So, Paul, thank you for coming into the studio today.
Thanks for having me.
So, first off, what has got you excited about design these days?
What has me excited about design these days? Lately, it's been a lot of things. I guess the first thing is sort of this intersection of organic and man-made seems to be in my head.
Interesting.
Sort of thinking about...
Is this more of a recent
it's something I've
pattern?
always... it all stems from the symbol pi.
Okay.
So pi, 3.14159.265, et cetera, is obviously a mathematical number, and it has, there's a scientific side to it in use of calculation of area of circles, et cetera. But because of the way it doesn't repeat, there's this sort of pattern that's organic that develops in the way the numbers.
So the numbers of pi, if you run them out, they do not
never
repeat.
Oh, wow. They never repeat.
Okay.
So that idea of pattern and repetition that either doesn't have a scale or doesn't have a repetition to it is really kind of intriguing. Kind of moves into a little bit of the ideas of chaos theory that I sometimes touch on, where we understand pattern, but we don't know the scale of the pattern. Right. So weather patterns, for example, the closer you get, the more accurate you can be to predicting them. But
oh man, I got into a little bit of a rabbit hole on something to do with free will and the inability to forecast free will because of moral agents rather than physical agents, just cause and effect as a chain reaction. It kind of has an initial first thing, right, that started everything. But within chaos level, I think it's second level chaos theory is what it's called. It's kind of like weather, where there's free will influences and variables that make it, to a degree predictable, but not predictable.
Butterfly effect.
Yeah. It's very interesting as it applies to free will and kind of this other area.
Right.
So how does the pi not repeating, how does that apply to fractals? Because that's always an interesting thing to me too. Or not apply.
Fractals have a recursive repetition.
Right.
So whereas pi, because it doesn't have repetition, there's a lot of people who've carried it out to millions of decimal places looking for that.
They're just kind of waiting for it to repeat.
They're looking for some repetition, but it doesn't happen.
Wow.
And that's just the nature of it. But it's if you abstract it away from being a mathematical term or an integer or whatever, or whole, pi is a natural number. I'm going to get this wrong. But in any case, if you take it away from that and think about it just from the idea of repetition or lack of repetition in a way of sort of challenging symmetry and composition in anything, whether it's a two-dimensional or three-dimensional form.
So how do you... This is another thing that applies to everything else that I'm kind of going through with truth. It seems that we have an intrinsic knowledge of beauty. We know it.
I would agree.
Whereas truth, becomes very relative when you break it apart. But then again, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's very subjective to a degree too. But
To
we
some
seem
degree,
to agree.
but there are some universal or maybe cultural.
Sure, that's an interesting conversation too.
Yeah, in terms of sort of a culture that would find beauty in certain things. I mean, go back to the Greek culture in terms of, all of the classical architecture that was developed. It's like there was an inherent sense of proportion and beauty that was applied to all things.
So what's your take on the golden ratio as it applies to pi and fractals and non-repetition?
Well, the golden ratio is one of the more fascinating things. I was just doing some reading about how if you look at human DNA, that a full turn of a double helix strand actually has a size of 21 by 34 angstroms, and 21 and 34 are both numbers in the Fibonacci sequence, which also
another great
average to the golden section, or phi, or phi, the phi, phi, pho. So when you think about that connection at a molecular or DNA, being hardwired even in proportion in DNA to that, to the Fibonacci sequence, which ties into the golden section very nicely.
It is amazing when you see, visualization of just the DNA double helix, the beauty of that.
The
even
structure.
at that unseen to us level is just, really incredible. How do you extract from these mathematical, in many ways, abstractions that are in one realm, very objective, they're numbers, but then apply them to raincoats and materials and architecture? How do you personally go through that and do that?
Well, that's the challenge, I think. And it's sometimes I'll do it and it feels like it's just applied. It's sort of like, okay, this is just an application of something very direct and it doesn't have any depth. And other times,
kind of easy to phone in at sometimes.
Right. Well, yeah, but I guess sometimes even if you haven't phoned it in, it just comes out looking like you did, and that's not always a good thing. But thinking about sometimes it's reverse engineered. Like you look at a composition or proportional system or something that you developed, and then when you start to actually measure it, you realize that yes, those Fibonacci numbers come out, or the golden section is what makes it feel right. So I guess in terms of most success, it's when it sort of just happens almost because it's part of us.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
So I hate to say it's like, however you get the idea, but, in the whole conversation of where do ideas come from and where do you, why did you think of that here? And when I try to, even in things that I've done, try to deconstruct where those ideas came from, it's like they come from different periods of my life that seem to have been connected by some thread somehow that becomes a thing.
As a designer, do you think there's a typical personality type for a designer, or I'm very interested in. I'm educated as an architect and work as an architectural photographer, and love to create. But it seems like my mind is like I woke up at whatever it was 3 something this morning, and lo and behold, my mind was already awake, going 100 miles an hour, and I just couldn't go back to sleep. And I don't know if it's an overactive mind. I'm sure that applies to people who don't work in a creative field too. I'm sure they end up with that, but you
must find that it ebbs and flows as well. I mean, sometimes you have periods of real intense thought, and sometimes those thoughts are focused, and sometimes they're not, and at other times it seems like those thoughts go away. But to get to your question about personality type and creative types, I don't think there's one, but I think you can look at different personality types, whether you're looking at, Myers-Briggs, or you're looking at other ways of measuring personality and applying them to creativity. There's different types of creatives.
Right.
And one of the things that I sometimes talk with people about is this concept of design from concept to realization of 1 to 10. There are there are individuals who are great at the 1 through 2 or 1 through 5, and then there's people who are great at like from 2 to 10. Taking something and you think about people they're all creatives, right? But they're taking an idea that maybe they didn't have the spark of the initial idea, and then running with it, or they're not able to generate that or ideate those early concepts. But that could be a personality type, or it also could be this ebb and flow of some time where you're just like popping with initial ideas.
So there's two interesting things in me there: the ebb and flow, and I wonder if everyone's creative, but just in different ways, right? So like
creativity absolutely expresses itself different ways.
Yeah. So I have a person who I'll just name as a very good friend of mine, who when this person discovered the golden ratio, that became something that this person just like grabbed onto, and would not give their opinion on something until they had measured and made, it was like this person had found an answer to understanding aesthetics at that point, and it was a one size fits all.
Rather formulaic too.
Very formulaic. And this person, in my opinion, in most parts of life was not very creative, but when it came to writing, this person was very creative.
Right.
And in like interpersonal communications and just interacting with people, it's just amazing where I just fall flat, and if like a one-on-one thing, I'm fine. But if it's in a group, I'm just like, but the ebb and flow thing you talked about, that's interesting to me too, because I find that I'll go through very, very difficult periods that I would say border on slight depression. And I feel like actually my mind's like on an uphill battle of working things out. And that's just kind of me feeling that. And I just take care to get a lot of cardiovascular exercise.
Right.
And on the other side of that, I constantly have this, like, all of a sudden, like, my mind figured everything out and it all comes out, and there's a lot of progress
to the point where you almost want to write down that list of things. So I sometimes will do that. Well, I'll write down, when in these periods of a lot of ideas, write down, one word that will trigger that memory. I try to link a word to not the memory, but the idea or the memory, the creative concept. What is it, and also to remind myself that these are the things I actually want to do as opposed to the things I need to do.
Right. Now I'm in the problem right now of having so many things I want to do that like I've loaded so many up that I get to the point where I'm like, what am I going to do? There's too many to do. I don't have.
Right.
I need to hire more people, but I have.
Then you have
money.
to prioritize them and slowly chip away. I mean, there's a project that I've been wanting to do now for 2.5, 3 years, and I have. And it's interesting because to do it, I need to both design it, conceive it, but I also need to create a space for it. So, and it's been these very small moves over the past few years to try to get to that point. I'm feeling a little closer than I was at it, but and excited because I think it's a good winter project. So I'm like thinking, okay, this might actually happen, or maybe I should take another step in the process. So usually I don't plan that much. Usually I dive right in and do something, and that's what I did with doing these sort of vignette sketches that are part of this. I've just kind of like, okay, I'm going to do this, and this is part of it, and it starts to help me figure out the bigger piece. But that, for some reason, this project is taking a different path for me because it's not one where I'm thinking about. Or it's one that I'm actively thinking about it, I guess, as opposed to just like diving in and doing something, which happens.
So what are the things outside of the practice of architecture that really fuel your, that recreate you and give you that energy to go back in and do what you get paid for?
Well, you were talking about cardiovascular things. I mean, exercise is something for me that really both clears my head and also time when I get ideas.
Isn't that amazing? Like during exercise, you have to stop sometimes and like, I got to write this down because
Right. I mean, on a long run, I'll find that's when I get some great ideas. It's also a great place to work out like frustrations in my head, like having conversations with people that you don't want to have, but you have them during your run, so then they're out in the ether. You don't have to worry about it. And just finding those moments. Swimming is another one I love because when I get in the groove of swimming, it's just this fluid motion, and then
Yeah.
your brain can all of a sudden start to wander. So those are different ways that I try to sort of recharge the creative energy. But
So talk to me about you have more than other architects I've interacted with. You have a lot of activity outside of architecture that applies to design with fashion and,
Right.
and materials. Talk to me about that and how they feed each other.
Well, I can start with fashion, and with fashion for me, it's both sewing and designing and creating. It's the process of drawing something up, but it's also figuring out how you're going to make it and then making it.
Do
So
you actually make these things yourself?
absolutely, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. No, I started out as learning from my grandmother when I was 10 how to sew.
Wow.
And then that turned into doing upholstery and slipcovers, and then I started working in form, and that was then when you start thinking about it, architecture is really very similar. It's all about form.
Yeah.
And then from there started moving more into design, and then taught myself how to make patterns out of measurements and how to drape, and started researching, more and just thinking more about it.
So are you wearing any of your things now?
Not today.
Oh.
No, I'm not. I'm wearing things I admire from designers I admire. But no, I have there was an event last week where I wore some things that I made.
Cool.
And there's some more pieces I'd like to make, but that's another one of these time things.
So an interesting similarity here is that my senior year in high school, I got my hands on a sewing machine.
Mm-hmm.
And I spent a lot of time in my room my senior year making clothes. They were horrible.
But the machine itself is fascinating.
Oh, it was
And that's
so
how it
cool
started
to,
for me.
I oh, wow, I can take this old thing and I can
Right.
make a hat. And
Yeah.
then I figured I made snowboard pants for myself out
Yeah.
of blue tarp material.
Mm-hmm.
And they worked really well until the material wore out. And then,
Yeah, it doesn't hold its seam very well. You have to
No.
reinforce it
No, yeah.
with
I
duct
didn't
tape.
know that. Yeah, there you go.
But then it's hard to sew through.
But man, I got made fun of a lot for oh, he's in there sewing more clothes.
Oh yeah, well you can go through the whole world of what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. But yeah, sewing was always something I enjoyed. The other thing is another one of the dark arts, I'll call it, which is macrame, knotting. I mean, it's something I learned when I was very young, and I've been doing it now for 40 years.
So
and,
what is macrame again?
Macrame it's decorative knotting, and it really started out with sailors developing the art it comes from a number of different places, but they developed this way of embellishing objects when they were out to sea and board.
Oh,
So okay, so let's just cover this wine bottle with this net of knots. I mean, they were already making nets and repairing nets, so they knew how to work with string and rope. And I started, and you make the plant hangers, and now, I mean, a couple of years ago, I was at Haystack and for their open door session, and I was working on a fiber studio, and I was making these sort of three-dimensional shapes out of wire that were knotted. And for me, it was all about materiality, and it was also about the three-dimensional form. It's like macrame, a knot is inherently maybe two-dimensional, or 2.5D or 2.25D, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
But we were talking about the DNA helix earlier. It's like there's a certain knot, not a square knot, but a half knot, that when you tie a sequence of them, turns like a helix.
Yeah, I found certain types of ropes, when you keep twisting them really hard, eventually they get
flip on themselves,
and then they start to do that double helix look.
Yeah. So I mean, it's obviously just about stresses and the shape of the knots in this case, but yeah, macrame is something that is another one of these Zen moments when I'm just working on something. I don't do it as often as I'd like, but it's another one of those things. I mean, it's the same. It turns into for me a lot of working with fiber, textile, but fiber and rope and yarn and wire and looking at it more sculpturally. How do you take weaving even? I don't weave, but the process of weaving. But how do you take these two-dimensional objects or a line, a string, and turn them into form?
Right.
Same thing with fashion. When you think about, like on a jacket, how the sleeve goes into the body of the jacket, there's these double compound curves that form the arm's eye, and that is this magical thing when it comes together, and it just has a three-dimensional shape. And these were both cut flat.
Right.
So I find that just fascinating. Anything that becomes sort of transformational, to go from 2D to 3D with materials.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about the macrame. It takes me back. I remember just simply making things because I wanted to make them, and there's like you're saying, a Zen moment of you're just creating, and you get lost in it, and it's like your mind is maybe unwinding while you're doing that. And I've definitely found, since I've been a sole proprietor for the last 12, 15 years, I don't nearly do that anywhere near as much. I should probably take more care to actually do that. But it's now when I create, it's for visual arts that have to have the end result of paying the bills.
Right.
And now I don't really pick up a camera unless I'm getting paid. I'm not one of those people who is constantly holding a camera and shooting, because if I shoot something, I'm making work for myself.
Right.
And so I want to reserve that creative energy for that. And it's
but it can blur as well.
It definitely blurs, but my personality, with that kind of thing, I don't like it. I don't want to do it unless like with visual arts, I want a plan that I establish ahead of time with an end result. Like if I just go out and like capture little things, I feel like I'm just making work and I don't know what I'm going to do with it.
Right.
Whereas if I'm physically making just something that I can put on the shelf or hang somewhere, in that way, it's there's that physical making that's very therapeutic that I do enjoy.
Right.
So, do you have a foundation or touchstone that guides you in theory of design as you work? Like a real kind of base level that you go to for this is good and this is bad, according to Paul Lewandowski as he's creating.
Interesting. If this is good or bad, I don't know if I have one of those. I mean, other than we talked about that sort of innate sense of something is good or bad when you look at it and you look at a composition, and that can change as well. But in general, sort of thinking about, no, that works, or sort of take a sidestep when we were talking about proportional systems and rules, and you were talking about the golden section. It's like, well, as with any rule, I think something that I learned from, this actually may be part of this answer. When I was in college, my first few years, I was doing things I hadn't really clicked with me, architecture school. I was doing the work, and the assignments were coming and all that, but there was no like magic happening until my third year. I had a professor who was from Italy, and Sandro Marpellero, and he would show up in the studio in the best clothes ever, and he had this like Kelly green briefcase, and he just became like the icon. It's like, this is how I want to be, like this. He's got the style down.
I had the same thing with a professor that was from somewhere in Europe.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, so they become this icon just because of how they design their life in a way.
Right.
But what he said was, which was really quite basic, was you make the rules so you can break the rules. And that one to me sticks in my head a lot, because as with all of these theories and the golden section and everything, it's like you're making a rule, or you're discovering, however it comes to be, but there's a rule for the creation. And then somewhere breaking that allows you to have this freedom to do something. It's the same way when I talk about drawing the things that you don't want. Like if you're coming up with a number of options for something, I will sometimes draw, the things that make you cringe, when you see them.
That's interesting.
But you want to get them out so you can say,
this is
definitely
what we're avoiding.
This is what we're avoiding. Name
Right.
it. It's like, give it a name in a way, and that, or give it a rule. And this is the rule. It will not be this. So you're breaking the rule that way.
In my creative process, I'm always looking for people who can point out where I've fallen short.
Yeah.
That can actually emotionally, ruin what I've created. from a place of authority and well-informed opinion.
Right. A good critic is
yeah.
a great thing.
Yeah, a good critic is really hard to find,
Yeah.
especially as a sole proprietor photographer. Most of the people, like, I don't know if this is the same with architects. I found it to be somewhat true. I generally avoid following other photographers on social media or Instagram or anything else that are within my sphere of, work or anything else, because anytime I see anyone else getting work, it's like, oh, I failed. I'm never going to get another job. And it's ridiculous.
I hate to agree because it's embarrassing, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so, and
well,
that's
it's like
just
when a design magazine comes out and you read it and it's like, or you're looking at the pictures and you're thinking, I can't remember, when you're jealous of something, that means it's really good.
Yeah.
Not that I encourage people to feel these like horrible emotions, but when you look at something and you're like, man, I wish I had designed that,
right.
Or I wish I had come up with that, or I had that, whatever it is that sparking that horrible emotion. That it's not a good feeling because it does make you feel a little bit like you've.
Right. But it's kind of a fire too to keep you going.
That as well. Yeah.
Is it like the creative version of competition?
Well, competition it's interesting you say that because we were talking about metrics for personalities, and one of the ones that I've gone through is called Strength Finders, which is all positive psychology, and there's like 35 strengths, and you take this test and it's supposedly foolproof, you can't cheat it, and you get your top 5 strengths. And one of my top 5 strengths is competition, which whenever I tell people, they're like, competition's a strength? It sounds like a personality flaw. But the way it's described by in this process is that with competition, when others around you are raising the bar, or are doing good things, it raises your own bar. You lift your effort to do better. It can easily turn negative, so you have to really watch to not become like competitive to the point where you're all the negative emotions that could come with being competitive without naming them. But I think if you think about it from a positive standpoint, it's like when I'm working with people who are very talented, my game is better,
right?
Because I'm matching them, or I'm competing against them. But I perhaps they're doing the same. It's sort of
they're influencing and inspiring you.
Exactly, and that cycle goes. Hopefully, it's a two-way cycle because when you can start riffing off someone else and thinking about ideas that way, that's magic when that can happen.
Yeah,
and that's almost as hard to find as a good critic because they're kind of the same people sometimes.
Oh yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, and I always struggle with highly. I very much want to be able to control my own schedule, not be attached to anyone else's schedule, to do as I please, create as I please. I don't play well with others as far as like in a every single day team setting. Like if I come together for a project on something and I know my part, I can do it, and the other people are great, it's great. But I'm a horrible employee. Like I'm unemployable, really. But if I'm running my own show, you get out of my way.
Right.
But as an employee, I think it's a personality flaw of some sort.
I don't know if it's a flaw. I understand that. I think that's again, being a creative is, or being someone who is, has those tendencies or is finding them. It's a challenge to understand how to use them, and in any situation when there's whether it's someone below you or above you or you consider equal to them. I don't know if everyone does it, but you assign sort of hierarchy to people that you come in contact with, and I think when you can find sort of equality with people or see the equality in them, I think that's when the best work comes out. Because if you're working for somebody, it feels like you're selling your soul. And if you're and then working with someone who's less experienced is also a challenge, because as a mentor you want to encourage them and listen to them. At the same time, we can all go back and think about experiences we've had as interns where they weren't so great. It's like you should do this because I'm your boss doesn't feel good.
Right.
So in that structure of hierarchy of I don't know, it's not really workplace. It's just hierarchy of design, I guess. It's a challenge to think about, always trying to figure out where you fit in a way. And I always look at especially in fashion, the high-end designers and have this reputation for basically being prima donnas and everything is their way. And I could see how someone could get to that point, but it can't be a lot of fun. It can't.
Yeah.
It's got to be a weird place to be when people just do what you say and make everything happen for you. I mean, yes, on one hand, you get this open creativity, but are there any challenges to it?
But I mean, at the same time, there's a lore, around people that reach, pinnacle in any field that many times they're not real great to be associated with.
Right.
I mean, there's infamous stories about Steve Jobs and the way that he would push people and everything else. And I mean, you name any field. And
right,
the
absolutely.
highly accomplished people. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean,
right.
What's
yeah, no,
what's
he's
the
a
give
great
and
one
take?
as an example, because it was his way or the highway a lot, yet he was a mentor and a teacher. And then you look at his work and his, it's like,
it's visionary.
yeah, it is. And it was consistently so, and it evolved over his career in many different ways. And there were actually, I say, there were not a lot of missteps. I mean, there's not a lot of things that he's done where you look at them and go like, really?
Yeah.
I mean, even like some of the wacky stuff, like the Marin County Courthouse, and he did a church in Milwaukee that was the same time, that has that shape, and it's like this spaceship. Or at the Johnson Wax, he did this auditorium that's like a spaceship landed, and it's literally painted gold. But it just still has this,
Right.
essence to it, that this level of thought.
The Johnson Wax Museum is one of my the interior images from just being under those lily pads is just
Oh yeah, and if they've just reopened the tower now, see the
right.
research tower, which is amazing because it's a tower of a very small lab just stacked up with a stair that goes up and an elevator in the center and just all of this workspace. And it's not, you would never build a lab like that anymore because you'd want it to be on one floor so you could expand and grow. And this was all these designated rooms, but the the glazing is all tubes that are like cemented together, and that's how we got insulated glass, by making tubes instead of. And it everywhere you turn, there's a different detail that is just revolutionary.
Yeah, I think it's I.M. Pei's building that's on the Christian Science campus there in Boston, is it?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I did a interior shoot there for someone that had just fitted out one of the spaces, and I think before I went in there, I wasn't thinking, oh, this is an I.M. Pei building, but as I was in there, I noticed the permanent structure, even that, like, there was some DNA there. I was like, whoa, look at, and there was these little moments within it that could not have been renovated to be there. They were already there, that were really incredible, just little like single person moments where you could sit, like this whole building curved to make this moment for this person to sit next to some glass overlooking, and it was really, really neat to see. When did you realize that design was your thing? For our younger listeners.
Design has always been my thing.
I'm sure, anyone in their teens has made it this far.
I remember third grade, I was in the schoolyard, and my mother, God bless her, came to the schoolyard, and she had an errand nearby and said, "Do you want to take art lessons?" And I said, "Yeah." I mean, I had never taken any. It was painting lessons with in town with somebody, and that was really interesting because, first off, it was a great expression of support from my mother for my creative nature that she had seen, but and it was, I'll call it my first formal training, because before that it was just crafts at home or things like that. But I'd always made things. I mean, it goes back to Lincoln logs and Lego blocks and even before that. I mean, I mean, I remember times of just, playing with my Fisher-Price farm set and like thinking about, they had these little plastic fences and you could create space with them basically, and it's like, so the animals would, and it was great because the chicken could sit on top of the fence, and it was like, okay, so they could become these elements, and it was, I mean, it wasn't a design play set, but even still I was thinking about how you create this environment with it.
It's interesting to me that did you say it wasn't really to your third year in architecture school that you ran into this professor that was influential?
Yeah, it was my third year. Yeah, my bachelor's of architecture. It was a 5-year program.
Yeah. So interesting for me. I mean, it's like the first classes. Caleb Johnson.
Yeah.
He went to we were in high school together, and he went into architecture. And I was looking at the stuff that he was doing like day to day, and I was like, wow, that looks like fun, But I was just kind of thinking with my other brain that, well, I got to be like a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, or dentist, I think is what I was doing. But when I saw like what they were doing, that was, really great stuff. And it wasn't until kind of life took a left turn with a girlfriend at the time and everything else that I then was like, screw this, I'm going to architecture school. And it's like the first classes for me were just like, this is incredible. I love, the
first classes are really, it's interesting because they're make or break for so many. I went to Rensselaer Polytechnic for architecture school, which was a great fit for me. And I think with any school, it has to be a great fit for the different person, but it was great for me. There were 55 of us in the first year class, and the next year there were only 26 of us. The others had transferred, they had changed majors, and then we got a whole new bunch of people coming in. And it was interesting because, first off, it wasn't, first year of architecture school, it was all amazing things. It wasn't about designing a house. I mean, it was about drawing. It was about perceiving. It was about learning. It was, the projects weren't even, I just remember some of those projects, they were just so hypothetical or like,
See, that kind of
projects.
Annoyed, like the hypothetical projects to me annoyed me. Like I wanted restrained budgets so I could find where the creativity was in the project rather than just sky's the limit,
Well,
as odd for me.
As I was saying, for me, I did those exercises and tried my best, but it never clicked until that third year.
You saw this example of kind of an embodiment.
Well, it was this embodiment, this professor, Sandro, but he was looking at art. And we were designing spaces for art, and we were designing spaces for people. I guess he was very influential in my career because he was beyond architecture in so many ways. I mean, he cared about or he was very conscious of how he dressed and what he presented as a person. He was very interested in art. He was well traveled. It was more than just I'm an architect. It was more about a lifestyle, I guess, as an architect in a way, or as a designer, maybe more than an architect.
Yeah, interesting. Last question. I think so. Give me a general take on, and this is intended to kind of speak to a broader audience, but how do you approach design with a client? Because you're the one who knows everything about design, essentially.
Well,
if we're being honest,
I like to think of it as being a guide and being an educated guide, not knowing everything because.
As far as the design theory goes, you're the guy with the knowledge, but they're coming with the problems, but also their own taste and ideas.
Right.
How do you?
Well, every client is different. That goes without saying. And I think that there are clients who have a lot of ideas, and then there's clients, and sometimes they're not the best ideas. And then but you have to listen. You have to help them and almost teach them as to why what they would like to do might not be the best solution. And of course, I guess that is the presumption that you know what's right and wrong. But that's the kind of, when you talk about knowing everything, that's how I think about it. But then sometimes I think it's always it's hard to say compromise, because you're working with a client and it's their home or their building and they're paying for it. But sometimes there's things they just need, and if you can't hear what those are, you won't have success. It's like it might be a color, it might be a pattern, it might be a shape, and you need to work through it with them. And then sometimes you, as a designer, you have to say, yeah, there's going to be this thing in this project because it's important to them. And as a designer, it's always best to embrace those things. It's like drawing the thing that you don't want. So, but at the same time, that if you become the prima donna and you don't make those compromises, I think it's not as happy an experience. I mean, I guess there's maybe people who want that experience, but I think being able to compromise and being able to also understand what's important to people in terms of design. And they may not know what it is. They may, like I said, it may be that they want comfort, and somehow if you give them a cold gray space, they won't feel comfortable.
Right.
So it's always different. And I think that's, as I practice more and more and work with different people, it's like that's what's emerging, is this understanding of that you have to let go certain things, you have to guide things, and just sort of make the compromises. I do have a rule though of 3, which is like when I think there's something really important, I will present it 3 times before giving up on it. Because at 3 different times.
Paul, you've shown us this before. You're going to see it once more.
And I've had that one. Yes, I remember one client was like, "Yes, we know you like this. We're not doing it." And that was the 3rd time, and I said, "Understood." And then you have to give up at that point, right? Because you've tried and you've made your case. And if you can't make your case for it, then you're not really working with clients. You're a sculptor, or that's not a fair assessment for sculptors. You're just doing your own work. Right. You're just doing it for yourself. You're not doing it for anyone else.
Right. So I wonder, that's an interesting dynamic and line you have to draw. And I find that creativity is very emotional and personal for me. That's a real thing there. Yeah. And I have a really, really hard time if I feel strongly about something in my personal creativity. That my wife and I butt heads a lot
to give up on
in-house stuff and stuff like that, especially since I'm background as an architect. Business-wise, I think I separate myself from it generally enough to where I'll know clients well enough and what they're looking for. It's not as much of an issue. But yeah, creativity comes from a very personal place, and there's emotion attached to it. And I wonder if there's a degree that you have to kind of separate yourself from and kind of say, I'm giving my...
I don't think it's separation, because I wouldn't want to separate myself from a creative process. I think it's compromise.
You wouldn't want to get too emotionally attached to...
Well, that happens.
Yeah.
I think it's like having a child. It's like, you're always emotionally attached to them. They may do things that you don't care for or that you love. I mean, but it's like you're always connected to them. So I think with design, it's very much that you're connected to it. But part of it is confidence in that that things will still be okay in the design concept, because going back to knowing everything as a designer, which is really, again, maybe better told as having an aesthetic eye, or having an eye or a sense of proportion, or knowing by looking at something that it will work in a way that you can't really describe to. It's hard to describe to somebody. It's like, the chair wants to be over there. Well, the chair doesn't really want to be over there. You want it to be there, but it's going to work there. And that's where it's going to feel right because of whatever reasons. But when when confronted with a challenge on design, I think you have to really sort of think about why or what are these things. There's another practice that I like, where it's when you look at something, the first thing you see is the thing you should take away, and see what's left in the composition. It's like, so, turn to something, first thing you see, take it away as an exercise. It may be that everything falls apart and that piece is crucial,
it's integral.
or it's gone and everything is still standing.
Interesting.
It's like this Jenga architecture.
Jenga.
But it's
Designed by Jenga.
Right, but that piece, then it wasn't that important, and it may have just been an emotional attachment to that piece or that idea or that concept. Because this translates through into writing or into design or drawing or everything.
Well, I see that a lot with film production edits that we'll do. I just keep cutting and cutting and cutting until I feel like, wait a minute, I lost this story, or the story just keeps getting better. And there's that moment where you feel like, all right. I mean, I think
it has a focus.
Yeah,
it's not like the original. The raw material could have gone into 5 or 6 or countless directions, but when you've edited down, as you should with design, and that's one of the real challenges for, I think, so many people, is editing down.
You're killing babies
design.
At that point. Like each one of those is your baby, and you've got to get down to the just the babies that belong here. And that's super hard.
That sounds horrible. But no, you're right. It does feel that way.
Yeah.
But the editing is really important, and because it gives you focus, and with that, and that's something that takes forever to learn, and forever to practice, to keep getting better at. It's like a muscle that needs to be worked out.
Yeah, and it becomes that second voice that
right
after time. And when I think back to when I first started doing photography, or I first started practicing architecture, and realize how inefficient I was and how poorly I did everything compared to someone who would charge 10, 20 times more and do it in 1/100th of the time and do it 100 times better than me, because they had developed over time that voice in their head that knew intrinsically what to do. And now, I used to get up for a photo job and I'd shoot, before the sun came up, and we wouldn't quit until the sun had gone down. And now I can do the same thing in probably a half a day. Because you just intrinsically know, you walk through a room and it's like all of a sudden the puzzle piece goes dink, and this is where we're going to shoot this from.
It clicks. Yeah.
So, we should probably end it on killing babies that are great.
Design ideas that we've grown very attached to.
Well, it's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you so much for coming down here and talking to us and sitting in for a portrait. Look forward to your article in the January issue of Main Home Design. And again, Paul Lewandowski, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.